The first thing Thenori noticed about the planet was the silence. Not the absence of sound, there was plenty of that. Wind scraping across the hull of the excavation shuttle, the tick of cooling metal, the hiss of her atmospheric processor cycling air that smelled faintly of minerals she could not identify. No, it was a different kind of silence. The silence of a place that should have been speaking and was not. The silence of a library with no books, a temple with no prayers. She pressed her face closer to the viewport as the shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere and watched the planet's surface resolve from cloud cover into clarity. Brown and green and blue, ordinary enough. River systems threading through continental masses, mountain ridges, coastal shelves. All of it broadly consistent with the archival surveys the Thenori Covenant had filed 350,000 years ago, when this world had last been visited and catalogued. But the surveys had described a world of primitive mammals and shallow oceans, a world where the dominant species chipped tools from bone and communicated in grunts, a world that the Covenant's theological board had classified as dormant sacred, meaning it possessed the geological markers of a world where the divine substrate might eventually manifest, but had not yet done so, and would not for millions of years. Thenori was an archaeologist. She had spent 2 centuries excavating dormant sacred worlds across the intergalactic arm, searching for evidence of the divine substrate that the covenant scripture promised existed beneath the surface of all consecrated planets. She had found it twice, trace deposits of the crystalline lattice the scripture called the breath of the makers, buried deep in geological strata on worlds that had been lifeless for billions of years. Both discoveries had advanced her standing within the Covenant's academic hierarchy. Both had confirmed what the theologians had always taught. The makers had seeded the galaxy with their breath, and it was the Covenant's sacred duty to recover it before lesser species contaminated the sites with their crude industry. This world, Sol 3, in the old catalog, was supposed to be the richest deposit yet. The original survey team had detected trace signatures of the divine substrate at depths the Covenant's mining technology could reach within a standard extraction cycle. The theological board had authorized a full reclamation mission. 12 vessels, 2,000 clergy soldiers, heavy extraction equipment, and Thenori's archaeological team of 9 specialists to document and consecrate the dig sites before the miners moved in. It was supposed to be simple: land, pray, dig, extract, depart. The primitive mammals, if they still existed, would be relocated or, if they had developed enough to resist, pacified. Standard protocol. The scripture was clear on the matter. Lesser species that occupied dormant sacred worlds were guests in the Maker's house, tolerated only until the Covenant came to claim what was rightfully divine. Thenori had not given the mammals a second thought during the 14-day transit. She had reviewed the archival surveys, studied the geological data, planned her excavation grid, and spent her evenings in the ship's chapel listening to the liturgist recite the canticle of reclamation while the stars blurred past the viewport. She had brought her best field instruments, the resonance scanner that could detect substrate traces through 6 kilometers of sediment, the molecular spectrograph that could date crystalline formations to within a 1,000-year margin, the coring drill that could extract pristine samples without disturbing the surrounding matrix. 2 centuries of fieldwork had taught her to trust her instruments the way the consecrator trusted his scripture. During the transit, she had also reviewed the Covenant's complete archaeological record of dormant sacred worlds. 41 such worlds had been reclaimed in the Covenant's 3,000-year history of organized extraction. Of those 41, 38 had been uninhabited when the extraction teams arrived, the local biospheres either extinct or reduced to microbial remnants. 2 had supported civilizations primitive enough to relocate without resistance, one a fungal colony with no apparent self-awareness, the other an insectoid hive that the clergy soldiers had herded into transport vessels over the course of a single day. The 41st world had been different, a dormant sacred site in the Pellarine Reach where the local species, an amphibian civilization with early industrial capability, had resisted relocation. The consecrator of that mission had ordered pacification. The operation had taken 11 days. The amphibians had been removed to a marginal moon in the outer system. The substrate had been extracted. The theological board had issued a commendation. Thenori had read that report twice during the transit. She had noted the careful clinical language: pacification, relocation, extraction, clean words for a process that had ended a civilization's connection to its homeworld. She had read it the way she read all historical documents, with professional detachment and a scholar's appreciation for primary sources. Now, 2 hours from landing, she was giving the mammals a second thought. Because the surface was wrong. The shuttle's pilot, a young clergy soldier named Vane, noticed it at the same time. "Dr. Thenori, the terrain is not matching the survey maps." She was already pulling the comparison overlay onto her console. The archival survey showed a river plain at their approach coordinates, seasonal flooding, alluvial deposits, scattered bands of mammals in temporary shelters along the waterline. The current sensor feed showed something else entirely. Geometric patterns, visible from orbit, straight lines where the survey showed meandering rivers, right angles where the survey showed irregular tree lines, and beneath the geometric patterns, buried but detectable, a low electromagnetic hum that the shuttle's instruments registered as background noise, and then, after Thenori adjusted the sensitivity, reclassified as structured signal. "That is not geological," she said. "What is it?" "I do not know." She ran the signal through the Covenant's archaeological database, a compendium of every electromagnetic signature recorded on every world the Covenant had ever surveyed. No match. The signal was too regular to be natural, too complex to be simple, and too powerful to be the product of a species that the last survey had described as pre-agricultural. She adjusted her resonance scanner, the instrument designed to detect the divine substrate through kilometers of rock, and pointed it downward through the shuttle's hull. The substrate was there. She could feel its signature on her instruments the way a musician feels a familiar note, the particular crystalline resonance that the Covenant's theologians called the voice of the makers. But the resonance was not coming from the deep geological strata where the original survey had located the deposits. It was coming from everywhere, from the geometric structures, from the roads, from the soil itself. The substrate signature was distributed across the entire sensor field, diffused into the built environment at concentrations her instruments struggled to measure because they had been calibrated for trace deposits, not saturation. 350,000 years. That was how long it had been since anyone from the Covenant had looked at this world. Thenori knew, intellectually, that 350,000 years was a long time. She had excavated sites older than that. She had held fossilized tools in her hands that predated the Covenant's founding by millions of years. Time was her professional medium. But she had never encountered a species that had used time like this. She thought of the 41st world, the amphibians in the Pellarine Reach, with their early metallurgy and their refusal to leave. They had resisted for 11 days. These beings, if the structured signals were any indication, had been building for 350 millennia. The scale was not comparable. It was not the same category. "Vane, patch me through to the consecrator." The consecrator was Kale Marath, the mission's spiritual and military commander. A tall, sharp-featured Thenori with ceremonial scars running from his brow ridges to his jaw, dressed in the articulated combat vestments of the clergy soldier caste, armor plating inscribed with scripture, a blessed sidearm at his hip, and the golden circlet of ecclesiastical rank clasped across his chest. He answered from the command vessel's bridge, where the rest of the fleet was holding in high orbit. "Doctor, your excavation sites are confirmed." "Consecrator, I need to delay the landing. The surface readings are inconsistent with the archival surveys. A pause. Moreth's voice came back, clipped and precise. Define inconsistent. The terrain has been modified. I am reading structured electromagnetic emissions across the target zone. And the divine substrate, I am detecting its resonance, but not from the deep deposits. It is distributed throughout the surface structures. The concentration pattern suggests it has been extracted and repurposed. Repurposed. Moreth's voice flattened the word into an accusation. By the mammals. Possibly. I need more time to analyze the data before. The mammals were classified as pre-agricultural 350,000 years ago, Doctor. They are bone tool users. Whatever you are reading is geological anomaly or instrument error. Proceed to the primary excavation site and begin consecration prep. The extraction teams deploy in 6 hours. Consecrator with respect, the signal density alone. Dr. Thenori. Moreth's voice hardened with the particular tone of a man whose authority derives from theology rather than evidence. The theological board has authorized this reclamation based on 350,000 years of confirmed data. The divine substrate is beneath this soil. Our duty is to recover it before contamination occurs. Land, pray, dig. That is the sequence. That has always been the sequence. The channel closed. Thenori sat in the descent shuttle and looked at the geometric patterns on her display and felt, for the first time in her career, a sensation she could not classify. It was not fear, not yet. It was the particular discomfort of a scholar who has just noticed that the evidence contradicts the text, and who knows that the text is considered holy. Vane was watching her. Doctor, take us down. The shuttle descended through the last kilometers of atmosphere, and the geometric patterns resolved. They were not ruins. They were not geological formations. They were not artifacts of sensor distortion. They were roads. The realization hit Thenori the way a geological fault shifts, not all at once, but in a cascade of small adjustments that accumulated into something seismic. Roads meant planning. Roads meant governance. Roads meant a species that thought in networks, in connections, in the disciplined imposition of order on a landscape. The survey from 350,000 years ago had described a species that followed animal trails through river valleys. These roads did not follow anything. They imposed. Perfectly maintained, laser-straight roads cutting across the landscape in a grid pattern that extended beyond the shuttle's sensor range in every direction. Between the roads, structures low at first, then taller, then much taller, rising in clusters that became dense enough to cast shadows across the roads and across each other. The structures were made of materials the shuttle's sensors could not immediately identify. Composites, alloys, crystalline elements arranged in configurations that suggested manufacturing processes far beyond anything in the Covenant's industrial catalog. And every structure, every road, every foundation, every tower resonated with the divine substrate. Her instruments sang with it, not trace deposits buried in geological strata, not faint signatures waiting to be excavated. Full integration. The substrate was woven into the infrastructure the way iron was woven into blood, not stored, not hoarded, not displayed in temples. Used, lived in, breathed. Thenori's hands trembled on the console. She steadied them. She was an archaeologist. Trembling hands were the enemy of clean data. Vane, how large is this settlement? The pilot ran the extended scan. When he answered, his voice had lost its professional detachment. Doctor, I cannot find the edge. The structures extend past our maximum sensor range in every direction. That is over 2,000 kilometers. That is not a settlement. No, that is a city. She let the word settle in the cabin. A city 2,000 kilometers across, built by a species that 350,000 years ago had been chipping tools from bone, built with the substance that the Covenant's theologians had spent millennia teaching her to revere as the literal breath of divinity. Vane, take us to the primary excavation site. Landing protocol, open terrain, outside the structural perimeter. There is no outside, Doctor. The structures cover the entire target zone. Thenori looked at the sensor map. The pilot was right. The primary excavation site, the coordinates where the original survey had detected the richest concentration of divine substrate, was now the center of a metropolitan area so vast that its boundaries were invisible from any altitude the shuttle could reach. Find a gap, a park, an open area, anything. Vane found one. A broad green expanse between clusters of towers, flat and maintained, with structures at its center, not buildings but something else. A cluster of low, dark shapes surrounded by pathways and secondary installations, arranged in a pattern that Thenori's trained eye recognized immediately. A memorial complex. She had excavated dozens across the galaxy. The spatial grammar was universal. Central monuments with radiating approach paths, oriented toward significant features, surrounded by contextual structures that told the story of what was being memorialized. They landed on the green expanse 300 meters from the central cluster. The shuttle's struts compressed into soil that the sensors immediately identified as engineered synthetic microorganisms maintaining chemistry in real time. Biological air filtration woven into the grass, atmospheric composition, regulated to tolerances that Thenori's instruments could measure but not explain the purpose of. She stood at the top of the ramp and looked at the world that was supposed to be filled with bone-tool mammals and shallow oceans. The towers rose around her in every direction, silver and white and pale blue, catching the afternoon sunlight and throwing it back in geometric refractions that painted the air with color. The nearest tower was perhaps a kilometer away, and it rose so high that its upper floors disappeared into a thin layer of cloud. Transit lines connected the towers at various heights, carrying vehicles that moved in streams so orderly they looked choreographed. Parks and green corridors threaded through the urban mass with the precise deliberation of a species that had solved its own nature and built accordingly. Above the towers, shapes hung in the sky, too distant and too large for Thenori to process immediately. Dark, angular, kilometers long. She would understand what they were later. Right now, she was focused on the memorial complex. She walked down the ramp on legs that felt mechanical. Vane followed, his sidearm drawn, his head swiveling between the towers with the nervous attention of a soldier who has been trained to identify threats, and is finding them in every direction simultaneously. The air was warm, clean, and smelled of engineered pollen. A biological air filtration system woven into the grassland, her instruments confirmed, maintaining atmospheric purity in real time. The grass under her boots was so uniform it felt synthetic, and the substrate resonance pulsed through it, faintly but unmistakably. The divine mineral was in the soil, in the grass, in the air. Thenori walked toward the memorial complex with her full archaeological survey kit activated, resonance scanner, spectrograph, atmospheric sampler, translation suite, and the high-resolution data recorder she used for documenting dig sites. If this was the last thing she documented in her career, she would document it properly. The central monument was a black stone obelisk, approximately 30 meters tall, with a broad rectangular base. Basalt, quarried from the planet's volcanic ridge system according to the shuttle's mineralogical scan, but treated with a preservation process that her instruments could not identify. The stone registered as effectively ageless, immune to the weathering and oxidation that should have degraded it over the millennia since its installation. The surface was covered in carved text and symbols, multiple scripts, multiple languages. Some she recognized from the Covenant's linguistic archives, most she did not. The first thing she saw was the rectangular frames. Dozens of them, arranged in rows across the obelisk's four faces, each frame enclosing a symbol and accompanied by text in a script her translation suite did not recognize. She ran the suite over the nearest row and waited. Known THRATS, cataloged historical. The symbol inside the first rectangle was one she recognized. The interlocking circles of the Korath Dominion, a civilization that had collapsed over 270,000 years ago, one of the great powers of the ancient galactic arm, listed here, labeled, filed. She moved to the next entry. The branching lattice of the Pelarine hegemony, known THRATS, cataloged historical. The triple spiral of the Syndicate of Vas, same label. The angular crest of the Meridian Ascendancy, same label. She walked around the obelisk, her data recorder running, her translation suite processing each entry. The symbols grew more familiar as she moved through the list. Some were civilizations she knew only from the Covenant's deep archives, ancient powers that had risen and fallen before the Covenant's founding. Others were contemporary, active, powers that the Covenant traded with, competed against, or monitored through intelligence channels. All of them labeled historical. She stopped at one entry she did not expect to find. The sigil of the Varan Compact, a civilization that the Covenant's intelligence division currently classified as active, as a functioning spacefaring power with diplomatic representation on 14 galactic councils. The Varan Compact was not historical. The Varan Compact had a trade embassy on the Covenant's homeworld. But here on this stone in this park on this world, the Varan Compact was labeled historical, the same as the Korath, the same as the Pelarine, the same as every other power that had ever come here with hostile intent. These beings did not classify civilizations by whether they still existed. They classified them by whether they still mattered, and the Varan Compact apparently no longer did. Thenori felt something in her chest that she had no word for. It was not fear. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a dig site and understanding, suddenly, that the dig site was not contained within the boundaries she had mapped, that it extended in every direction, that she was standing on the surface of something far larger than she had equipment to measure. 47 entries, 47 civilizations spanning the full scope of the galactic arm's recorded history. Every major spacefaring power that had existed in the last 500,000 years, carved into this stone, framed, categorized, and filed under a word that reduced each of them to a footnote. And then on the final face near the base, she found the 48th entry. The circular crest of the Thenori Covenant, the interlocking rings of the Maker's breath, surrounding the central eye of divine purpose. She had worn that symbol on her academic robes for 2 centuries. She had it tattooed on her shoulder in the traditional ink of her scholarly caste. Known THRATS, cataloged historical. Her own civilization, carved into this stone, framed, labeled, filed alongside every empire that had ever surveyed this system, listed as historical, while its fleet sat in orbit at this very moment, while its consecrator prepared extraction teams, while its clergy soldiers sharpened blessed weapons. Historical. The word landed the way a fracture lands in a load-bearing wall, not with a crash but with a shift, a redistribution of weight, a quiet structural failure that would not become visible until the next stress. She knelt beside the base and ran her spectrographic analyzer across the Covenant's crest. The entry had been carved approximately 153,000 years ago, with a margin of error of plus or minus 800 years. Carved with tools of a precision exceeding anything in the Covenant's masonry catalog. Carved by hands that had studied the Covenant's insignia in sufficient detail to reproduce it perfectly. Every ring, every intersection, every proportional relationship between the central eye and the surrounding circles. She ran her resonance scanner across the obelisk itself. The stone was saturated with the divine substrate, not applied to the surface but grown through the basalt at a molecular level, the crystalline lattice woven through the mineral structure the way veins thread through living tissue. The substrate was what made the stone ageless. It was what powered the projected displays on the secondary plinths. It was infrastructure. The thought arrived with the quiet precision of a blade entering between ribs. The substance the Covenant crossed the galaxy to reclaim. The substance its theologians called the literal breath of the Makers. The substance for which the clergy soldiers would pacify and relocate and sterilize entire civilizations. These beings used it to preserve park monuments, the way you might use mortar to set a commemorative stone. They had decoded the Covenant's survey broadcast. They had learned the insignia, the doctrine, the theological framework, and they had carved the Covenant into a monument alongside 47 other civilizations. All of this while the Covenant had been filing their world under dormant sacred and scheduling a reclamation mission that arrived 150,000 years after these beings had already cataloged it as a known threat. Below the 48 entries at the very base of the final face, she found something else. Not an entry, a statement. A single glyph, 3 concentric circles with a vertical line through the center, with no rectangular frame, no categorical label. Just the glyph, and beneath it 2 words. We remain. Thenori stood in the warm afternoon light and felt the silence of the planet rearrange itself around her. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something that did not need to speak because everything it wanted to say was carved in stone and built into the sky. Dr. Vane's voice was tight. There are secondary structures around the central monument. She followed him to the nearest one, a low plinth waist-high made of the same treated basalt. On its surface, under a transparent protective layer, was a display not carved but projected from within the stone itself. The display showed an image, a rendering in accurate colors. A Thenori survey vessel in orbit above a green and blue world. Beneath the vessel, on the surface, small figures with scanner equipment walked among bipedal mammals who watched them from a riverbank. The mammals were crude, hairy, and held bone tools. The Thenori surveyors carried instruments she recognized from the Covenant's archaeological catalog, the same models she had trained on at the academy. Beneath the image, text. Thenori Covenant Survey Event 350,000 cycles before present. Mission classification, geological assessment, and theological site evaluation. Survey team broadcast unencrypted mission brief during standard approach. Assessment, divine substrate deposit confirmed. Species classification, pre-agricultural bone tool adjacent. Threat assessment, negligible. Action taken, none. Site classified as dormant sacred. Return window, open. They had transcribed the Covenant's own survey data, word for word, classification for classification, displayed in a park for anyone to read. She moved to the next plinth, another display. This one showed a different vessel, angular, aggressive, bristling with weapon mounts. A Korath warship descending through the atmosphere toward a surface more developed than the Thenori rendering, structures visible, roads visible but still early, still small. Korath Dominion Incursion Event 278,000 cycles before present. Fleet composition, 3 vessels, approximately 400 personnel. Action taken, fleet intercepted AT atmospheric boundary. Personnel relocated to fleet vessels. Fleet redirected to system perimeter. No casualties. Status, historical. Relocated, redirected. No casualties. 278,000 years ago, the Korath Dominion, at that time the dominant military power in the intergalactic arm, a civilization whose warships had conquered 47 star systems, had sent 3 vessels to claim this planet. And the bone tool mammals, who by that point had apparently developed atmospheric boundary interception capability, had simply moved the Korath out of the way and sent them home, the way you might brush an insect off a table. Not with malice, not with effort, with the casual, automatic efficiency of a response so deeply embedded it required no conscious decision. Thenori felt the hairs on her forearms rise beneath her suit. She had spent 2 centuries studying dead civilizations. She had never studied one that had been alive long enough to make the Koreth look like a passing inconvenience. She moved from plinth to plinth. Each told a different story. Each followed the same pattern. The Pelarine hegemony, 11 mining vessels redirected. The Syndicate of Voss, a diplomatic coercion flotilla of 6 ships redirected. A mercenary consortium whose name she did not recognize, 2 raider craft redirected. The Meridian Ascendancy, a reclamation expedition of 14 vessels redirected. No casualties in any engagement. Each plinth showed a more developed Earth than the one before. In the earliest renderings, the surface showed scattered structures and basic road networks. By the middle entries, cities were visible from orbit. By the later entries, orbital infrastructure was apparent. Platforms, stations, the dark angular shapes of warships in atmosphere. And with each entry, the interception had become more effortless. The early redirections had taken days of sustained field application. The later ones had taken hours. The most recent, a small scouting vessel from a civilization Thenori did not recognize, approximately 12,000 years ago, had been turned away in under 4 minutes. The mammals had not just built defenses. They had refined them, improved them across 350,000 years of iterative development, each interception feeding data back into a system that grew more efficient with every test. And each time, after the interception, they had added an entry to the monument and gone back to building. Thenori's communicator crackled, Moreth's voice. "Doctor, the extraction teams are deploying in 4 hours. Is the site consecrated?" "The site cannot be consecrated, consecrator. The divine substrate has been extracted and integrated into the infrastructure of a civilization that covers the entire target zone. The deposit no longer exists as a recoverable resource." Silence. Then, extracted by whom? By the mammals, consecrator. Over the course of approximately 300,000 years, they have processed it, refined it, and woven it into their built environment at a molecular level. I am standing in a memorial complex that documents 47 previous alien incursions into this system, all intercepted and redirected with 0 casualties. The Covenant is the 48th entry. Longer silence. When Moreth spoke, the theology was gone. What remained was the soldier. "Stay where you are. I am deploying the vanguard, full combat vestments. We will assess and reclaim." Consecrator, I strongly advise against military action. The documentation here indicates. The breath of the Makers belongs to the Covenant by divine law, Doctor. If these animals have taken it, we will take it back. This is scripture. This is purpose. The channel closed. Thenori stood beside the obelisk and, for the first time since landing, looked directly up at the shapes in the sky above the city. She had been avoiding them. The way a person avoids looking at a wound before they are ready to understand how deep it goes. They were warships. Human warships, hanging in the upper atmosphere in a formation so geometrically precise it looked ornamental, each 1 kilometer long, their hulls dark and angular, bristling with structures that even her limited military training identified as weapons platforms. The platforms were not powered. The weapons were not aimed. The warships hung in the sky the way mountains sit on the horizon, permanent, patient, unconcerned with the small things beneath them. She counted 7 visible from her position. 7 warships, each larger than any vessel in the Covenant's fleet, suspended in the atmosphere of a world the Covenant had classified as occupied by pre-agricultural mammals. The nearest was perhaps 40 kilometers away and 2 kilometers above the city, and even at that distance its hull detail was visible. Angular plating, sensor arrays, weapons rails running the full length of its ventral surface with a faint luminescence at their apertures that suggested standby power rather than active targeting. The warship was not threatening her. It was not even acknowledging her. It hung in the sky with the passive indifference of infrastructure that had been in place so long it had become part of the landscape. And they were not the defense system. Thenori understood that with the clinical intuition of a scholar who has spent 2 centuries reading evidence. The warships were visible deterrents, the architectural equivalent of a posted sign. The actual defense system was the thing she could feel humming through the soles of her boots, the substrate-laced infrastructure pulsing with a frequency her instruments registered as structured, intentional, and responsive. It was tracking her. It had been aware of her since the shuttle entered the atmosphere, cataloging her the same way she cataloged artifacts. She was the artifact now, a relic from a civilization this world had filed under historical 150,000 years before she was born. The mammals arrived before the vanguard did. They came from the nearest tower complex, walking across the green expanse in a loose formation that communicated neither hostility nor welcome. 7 of them, dressed in civilian clothing, no armor, no weapons, no military insignia. They were tall, bipedal, symmetrical. Their eyes were forward-facing and predator-set. They moved with the unhurried confidence of beings who had never needed to rush. The one in front was older than the others. White hair, deep-lined face, steady gaze. He carried a thin device in one hand. He stopped 20 meters from Thenori and looked at her with an expression she recognized. The face of a senior academic when a junior researcher presents findings that confirm what the senior already knew. He spoke. His device emitted a secondary audio stream in accented Covenant standard. You are from the Thenori Covenant. Your fleet is in high orbit. 12 vessels, 2,417 individuals. Your mission classification is theological reclamation. You have come for the crystalline lattice substrate that your scripture calls the breath of the makers. Statement not question. Thenori's filter membranes locked. She could not breathe for 3 full seconds. How do you know that? The old man looked at her the way she looked at a well-preserved fossil, with appreciation for its age and a clinical understanding of its irrelevance to the present. Because you told us. 350,000 years ago, when your survey team landed here, they broadcast a mission brief on an unencrypted channel. We were not capable of decoding it at the time. We decoded it approximately 12,000 years later when we developed the mathematics. We have been expecting this visit ever since. Expecting for 350,000 years. They had decoded the transmissions, understood the Covenant's purpose, identified the substrate beneath their own soil, and then, instead of fortifying against the Covenant's return, instead of building weapons aimed at the sky, instead of preparing a defense the way a frightened species prepares a defense, they had dug the substrate up themselves, studied it, understood its molecular structure, its properties, its potential, mastered it so completely that they exhausted the natural deposit and learned to manufacture more. And then they had woven it into their civilization, into their roads, their buildings, their soil, their atmospheric systems, their defense infrastructure, until it was indistinguishable from themselves. Until defending it was the same as defending their world, and defending their world was something their infrastructure did automatically, without effort, without attention, the way a living organism's immune system deals with a pathogen. They had not prepared to defend the substrate from the Covenant. They had made defending it unnecessary by becoming it. The entire planet was the substrate now. You could not extract one without dismantling the other. Your monument, Thenori said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. You listed the Covenant as a historical threat. We list every civilization that has surveyed this system with hostile or extractive intent. Your entry was the 4th, chronologically. It was added approximately 150,000 years ago, when we decoded your survey team's mission brief and understood the theological framework of your reclamation doctrine. You have known about us for 150,000 years, and you consider us historical. Something in his eyes shifted, a depth, a weight, the look of someone who has carried a truth for so long that it has become part of his posture. We consider every civilization that we have outlived to be historical, not because they are gone, because we remember them, and remembering is what makes something history rather than myth. Thenori's communicator chirped, Morath's voice urgent. The vanguard is deployed, 20 shuttles, mark the site for combat assessment. The old man had heard. His expression had not changed. Your commander intends to deploy soldiers. He is a consecrator. He believes the substrate belongs to the covenant by divine right. Does he? It is scripture. The old man nodded slowly, not in agreement, in the way a scholar nods when a student cites an outdated source. Dr. Thenori, I would like you to understand something before your commander's soldiers arrive, because I believe you are capable of understanding it, and I am not certain they are. Tell me. The substance your scripture calls the breath of the makers is a naturally occurring crystalline lattice found in the geological strata of approximately 1 in every 12,000 terrestrial worlds. It has no divine origin. It is the byproduct of a specific type of tectonic process that occurs in planets with active iron cores and silicate mantles. We identified its composition 310,000 years ago. We synthesize it now. The deposit beneath this city was exhausted 180,000 years ago. We have produced more of it synthetically in the last 50,000 years than the original geological deposit ever contained. Each sentence landed like a stratum collapsing. That is not possible, Thenori whispered. The breath of the makers is unique. It is the signature of divine intent. The theological board has confirmed its divine origin through 3,000 years of. Your theological board identified a naturally occurring mineral and built a religion around it. The old man's voice was not unkind. It carried the particular gentleness of someone delivering a truth they have rehearsed for a very long time, not because they enjoy the delivery, but because the alternative is silence, and silence would be worse. The mineral is useful. We use it extensively in our construction materials, our atmospheric systems, our containment fields, our information storage. But it is not divine. It is not yours, and it was never placed here for you to collect. It was deposited here by tectonic processes over the course of approximately 2 billion years, and it would exist with or without any species to call it sacred. The words settled over Thenori like volcanic ash, each one individually weightless, collectively suffocating. She was an archaeologist. She knew what it meant when the stratigraphy contradicted the theory. It meant the theory was wrong. It did not matter how many centuries of scholarship supported it, how deeply it was woven into the liturgy and the social fabric of the civilization that held it sacred. When the evidence spoke, the theory listened, or it became another entry on a monument in a park. Dr. Vane's voice was tight with controlled fear. Incoming the vanguard. Descending from the sky, not from orbit, from a staging point she had not detected, were the Covenant's combat shuttles. 8 in the first wave, in the arrow formation the clergy soldiers used for contested landings. Each carried 20 warriors in full combat vestments, armed with blessed weaponry, trained for the pacification of lesser species occupying dormant sacred ground. Behind the first wave, 4 more shuttles in support formation. 240 clergy soldiers descending toward a world whose defense system had been handling incursions for longer than the Covenant's entire theological tradition had existed. Your commander should recall his soldiers, the old man said. No urgency, no threat. Thenori looked at the old man. He stood with his hands folded over his tablet, watching the descending shuttles with the same expression he had worn throughout, patient, measured, unsurprised. His 6 colleagues stood behind him in a loose arc, equally unhurried. None of them moved toward cover. None of them showed alarm. One of them, the young woman with the handheld device, had sat down on the grass and appeared to be reading. Thenori grabbed her communicator. "Consecrator Moreth, abort the vanguard." These beings are not pre-agricultural. They are more advanced than the Covenant by an order of magnitude I cannot quantify. They have a documented history of intercepting every alien incursion for 350,000 years, with zero casualties on either side. Abort. They are occupiers of dormant sacred ground, Doctor. The Maker's breath belongs to the Covenant. Desecration is answered with reclamation. Consecrator, they have 47 civilizations on a monument here. Everyone tried what you are about to try. Everyone was turned away. The Covenant is not those civilizations. We carry the Maker's authority. Stand aside. The channel closed. The combat shuttles descended. And the planet responded. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that would stay with Thenori for the rest of her life, the absolute quietness of it. There were no alarms, no sirens, no visible weapons powering up. The warships in the sky did not move. The towers did not bristle with turrets. The people on the green expanse did not flee or take cover or even look up. One of them, a young woman reading something on a handheld device, glanced at the sky briefly and went back to her reading. The electromagnetic hum beneath Thenori's feet changed frequency. That was all. A shift in the vibration, a change in the pitch of the signal running through the substrate-laced infrastructure. So subtle she only noticed because her archaeological instruments were still tuned to maximum sensitivity. The 8 lead shuttles stopped. Not exploded, not shot down, not disabled by visible weapons fire. Stopped. Their engines continued to run. She could see the thrust plumes, but the shuttles hung motionless, as if the atmosphere had thickened into glass around them. Frozen in their descent formation, 8 arrowheads of consecrated alloy and blessed ceramic plating, held by something their instruments could not identify and their pilots could not fight. The 4 support shuttles hit the same boundary. 12 shuttles now, frozen in the sky like insects in amber. One shuttle fired its weapons. A blessed plasma bolt, the Covenant's standard anti-fortification round, capable of melting through 4 meters of hardened alloy, streaked downward. It traveled approximately 400 meters and dispersed, not deflected. Dispersed. The energy spread into the substrate field the way heat distributes into a large body of water. The shuttle rocked in its invisible cradle and steadied. Moreth's voice erupted on the open channel. All units, concentrated barrage. The Makers will cannot be denied. 8 shuttles fired simultaneously. 48 blessed plasma rounds in a coordinated volley, enough firepower to level a fortified military installation. Every round dispersed at the same altitude. The substrate field accepted the energy the way soil accepts rain. The sky absorbed the light and returned to its normal afternoon blue within 2 seconds. The warships overhead did not move. The young woman with the handheld device turned a page. Moreth ordered a second barrage, then a third. Each dispersed identically. Thenori's instruments registered each volley as a minor thermal event, the equivalent, in terms of the field's total energy capacity, of a match struck inside a furnace. After the third barrage, the field did something new. It moved the shuttles. Not violently, gently, the way a current moves a leaf. The 12 frozen shuttles drifted upward by approximately 200 meters, their formation maintained, their engines still running, their weapons now pointed at empty sky. The field had relocated them to a higher altitude, the way a parent moves a child's hand away from a flame. Moreth went silent. The silence lasted 45 seconds, an eternity for a military commander whose weapons had just been rendered irrelevant. "The field holding them is a containment protocol," the old man said. "Not a weapon. When your commander orders a withdrawal, the field will release them. And if he does not order a withdrawal..." The old man looked at her. In the lines around his eyes, she saw the weight of a species that had spent 350,000 years preparing for this conversation and hoping it would end well. We did not build our defenses to fight you. We built them to make fighting unnecessary. The field is the gentlest tool we possess. We would prefer to use nothing else. And if gentle does not work. He looked up at the warships, the 7 dark angular shapes, and something in his expression changed. Not to hostility, to sadness. Deep, geological sadness. The kind that accumulates over centuries of watching the same mistake repeated. Every civilization on that obelisk was offered the same choice your commander is being offered now. Some chose wisely. Some did not. The Korath sent increasingly larger fleets for 600 years before they exhausted their resources and collapsed. The Syndicate of Voss bankrupted 3 stellar economies trying to develop countermeasures that never worked. The Pellarine hegemony fragmented into civil war over whether to continue. None were destroyed by us. All were destroyed by themselves, by the refusal to accept what they were seeing. She looked at the frozen shuttles, at the towers, at the warships, at the old man. You are telling me we could join that list. I am telling you that the list exists. What your commander does with it is his choice. What you do with it is yours. Morath's voice returned on the communicator, different now. The theological conviction had cracked open. The humans had opened a direct channel to the command vessel, transmitting the obelisk data, the plinth documentation, the containment field specifications, and a measured invitation to withdraw in peace. All vessels, this is the consecrator. Hold position. Hold all positions. Do not repeat, do not engage. Then quieter, Dr. Thenori, what have you found down there? History, consecrator. I found history, and we are already part of it. There was a long silence on the channel. She could hear him breathing. She could hear the bridge crew behind him, the quiet rustle of officers processing what they had just been told. When Morath spoke again, his voice was very quiet. How long have they known we were coming? 350,000 years, consecrator. They decoded our original survey broadcast. They have a complete transcript of our mission brief from the first visit. They carved our insignia into a threat catalog 150,000 years before we developed compressed transit. Another silence. Then, Doctor, are you telling me they were ready for us before we even knew how to reach them? Yes, consecrator. That is exactly what I am telling you. The withdrawal took 9 hours. Each shuttle was released from the containment field one at a time, as the Covenant vessels powered down their weapons and broadcast confirmation of stand-down. Thenori watched from the green expanse as the shuttles rose, one by one, back into the sky from which they had descended with such theological certainty. She spent the waiting time studying. The old man led her to a section of the memorial she had not yet examined, a semicircle of larger plinths behind the obelisk, not incursion records, a timeline, the planet's own history, rendered in projected images covering a span that made her archaeological training feel like a child's primer. The first plinth showed the planet 350,000 years ago, bone tools, fire pits, population in thousands. The annotation noted that the Covenant's survey broadcast had been recorded, but could not be decoded for another 12,000 years. The second plinth showed the planet 50,000 years later, agriculture, permanent structures, river management, population in millions. The survey broadcast decoded, the Covenant's purpose understood. Third, 100,000 years after the survey, metallurgy, cities, written language, the crystalline substrate identified in the deep geological strata and its distribution mapped across the planet's tectonic zones. Fourth, 200,000 years, industrial civilization, atmospheric flight, first orbital installations, the substrate extracted from shallow deposits, its molecular properties under systematic study. Fifth, 250,000 years, space-based infrastructure, deep mining, substrate fully characterized, its synthesis begun, integration into construction materials underway. The first atmospheric warships, the first alien interception, the Korath, 3 vessels turned away without a shot fired. 6th, 300,000 years, planetary-scale substrate integration, synthetic production exceeding natural deposits by a factor of 12. The containment field operational across the entire atmospheric boundary. 12 more incursions intercepted and catalogued. 7th, the most recent, showed the planet as it was now, the city stretching beyond every horizon, the warships in formation, the substrate woven through everything from the grass to the orbital platforms. Technology indicators that exceeded Thenori's frame of reference in every category her instruments could measure. 350,000 years of uninterrupted building, displayed on 7 plinths in a park. A species that had gone from bone tools to planetary-scale substrate mastery without guidance, without divine intervention, without anything except time and the determination to keep going. "You documented everything," she said. "We are a species that remembers," the old man replied. "It is perhaps our only universal trait. We remember the fire pits and the bone tools. We remember the first cities and the first ships. We remember every civilization that came to our door and every label they gave us, negligible, dormant, deferred, primitive. And we remember what we chose to do with the time between their visits. Build and remember, and build some more." Thenori stood at the 7th plinth and looked at the image of Earth as it existed now. The city beyond every horizon, the warships in the sky, the substrate woven through everything. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to an archaeologist when the stratigraphy finally resolves into a narrative, that this was not a civilization that had been lucky. It was not a civilization that had been guided or blessed or touched by divine purpose. It was a civilization that had simply refused to stop. Through every catastrophe and every ice age and every extinction event, and every alien survey team that landed and labeled them and left, they had refused to stop building. And 350,000 years of unbroken refusal had produced something that no theology in the galaxy could account for. Not a fortress, not an empire, not a weapon. A world, complete, permanent, and unimpressed by the credentials of its visitors. His colleagues drifted back to the tower complex as the final shuttles departed. They did not watch the Covenant leave. The departure of an alien fleet was not an event that required their attention. That, more than anything, told Thenori the truth she had been circling, since the moment the geometric patterns appeared on her console. The Covenant's arrival, the Vanguard deployment, Moreth's theological fury, the blessed plasma barrages, the frozen shuttles hanging in the sky, none of it had been a crisis. None of it had even qualified as an interruption to anyone's day. The young woman who had been reading during the barrage had finished her book and left. A group of children, actual children, small and loud and chasing each other through the grass, had appeared in the park while the last shuttles were being released, playing some game that involved the secondary plinths as hiding spots. They did not look at the sky. They did not know that an alien military force had just been repelled from their world, or if they knew, they did not care because it was not unusual. It was not remarkable. It was something that happened sometimes, like weather. It was maintenance, a scheduled response to a predicted event, executed with the same unhurried competence with which the engineered grass filtered the air. They had been ready. Not the way a fortress is ready, armed and tense. The way a planet is ready, present, permanent, indifferent to the season. "Why do you keep the monument?" she asked as the last shuttle lifted off. "If you have outlived every threat it catalogs." He looked at the obelisk with the expression of someone who preserves the past not because it is useful, but because it is the record. Because without the record, the present has no depth. "Because memory is what we built everything on," he said. We remembered every survey team that landed here, every mission brief, every label negligible, dormant, deferred, primitive, and we kept building, not to prove them wrong, not to prepare for their return. We kept building because building is what we do. Their return was always going to happen eventually. We wanted to be ourselves when it did. Thenori's shuttle was waiting. Vane stood at the ramp, his face pale, his hands steady only through visible effort. She walked toward the shuttle and stopped. "Will you add today to the monument?" "We added the covenant 350,000 years ago," the old man said. "Today was the confirmation. We will update the entry with the date and the outcome." "We always do." She looked at him standing beside the obelisk in the golden late afternoon light, the towers behind him, the warships overhead, the children playing among the plinths that documented 350,000 years of alien incursions. He looked like what he was, a custodian of a world that had solved the problem of survival so completely that it had moved on to the problem of meaning, and had been working on that second problem for longer than most civilizations survived. She wondered how many times he had stood in this park and watched an alien shuttle lift off. She wondered if it ever felt remarkable to him. She suspected it did not. She suspected that for these beings, the arrival and departure of alien civilizations was less significant than the seasonal change of whatever flowering plants grew in the park's borders, because the flowers came back every year, and the civilizations, by and large, did not. Thenori climbed the ramp. The shuttle lifted off. The city fell away beneath her, vast, ordered, quiet, its towers catching the last light, its roads pulsing with the substrate the Covenant had crossed the galaxy to reclaim, and that these beings had woven into their world the way thread is woven into cloth. She looked down as the shuttle climbed. The green expanse shrank. The obelisk became a dark point in the grass. The towers closed around it and then opened out as the altitude increased, revealing the full scale of the city, the grid of roads, the transit networks, the parks, the secondary urban centers that stretched to the coast and beyond. She watched the warships pass beneath her, each one impossibly large at this altitude, their hulls dark against the green and silver and white of the city they guarded. She watched the atmospheric boundary where the containment field had held the Covenant's shuttles, invisible now, unmarked, indistinguishable from ordinary sky. The green expanse became a spot of color in the grid, and then the grid was a pattern on a continent, and then the continent was a curve on a sphere, and then the sphere was a point of light in the dark. A world that had spent 350,000 years becoming something that could not be taken, only witnessed. The Covenant's fleet withdrew to the system perimeter. Morath consulted the Theological Board via compressed transit relay for 3 days. The Theological Board consulted its archives, its doctrinal authorities, its senior consecrators. The archives had no precedent. The doctrine had no provision. The senior consecrators had no counsel that did not begin with Scripture and end with the same stone wall Morath had already struck. 3 days of compressed transit communication, burning fuel and political capital at a rate that Thenori calculated would bankrupt a mid-tier colony, and the Theological Board's final ruling was a single word: withdraw. Not reconsider. Not reassess. Withdraw. The distinction mattered. Reconsideration implied the possibility of return. Withdrawal was a statement of finality that the Theological Board had not issued in the Covenant's entire doctrinal history. The word carried weight. It carried shame. And it carried, buried beneath the institutional language, a fear that Thenori recognized because she felt it herself, the fear of a system that has encountered evidence it cannot process and has chosen to turn away rather than revise. Thenori submitted her documentation and her recommendation. The report was 400 pages. The recommendation was 4 words. Leave them, they remember. The fleet departed on the 4th day. Thenori stood at the observation gallery and watched the blue world shrink to a point and vanish as compressed transit engaged. She carried the data wafer around her neck for the rest of her career. In the years that followed, she would take it out during long transits and review the data, the substrate readings, the obelisk inscriptions, the plinth timelines, the containment field signatures. Each time she understood a little more. Not about the humans, she would never understand them fully, any more than a river stone understands the river, but about the covenant, about the assumptions embedded in its theology, about the particular arrogance of a civilization that finds a useful mineral in the ground and decides it was placed there by gods for them to collect. She never spoke of it publicly. She never challenged the theological board. She simply carried the data and let it change her slowly, the way water changes stone, not by force but by presence, by the quiet weight of evidence against a theory that could not accommodate what she had seen. Two colleagues noticed over the decades that followed. Her excavation partner, who saw her hesitate before consecrating a dig site and asked if she was unwell. Her department chair, who observed that her technical writing had shifted. She had begun describing the divine substrate as the crystalline lattice in her reports, dropping the theological designation without comment or explanation. Neither pressed her. Neither knew what she had seen. But the data wafer hung around her neck, warm against her chest, holding the record of a world that had answered 350,000 years of being labeled negligible with the most devastating response any civilization could offer: patience. Not the patience of waiting for something to happen. The patience of building while nothing was watching. The patience of a species that understood the difference between temporary and permanent was not strength or divine mandate but time. And they had more of it than anyone who had ever come to their door. The theological board classified the entire mission. The intelligence division filed her report under a new category, one that had no precedent in 3,000 years of reclamation doctrine. The category was permanent. And on the surface of the world the covenant would never visit again. In the park between the towers, the obelisk stood in the evening light. 48 entries, 47 labeled historical, 1 labeled we remain. The entry for the Thenori Covenant had been updated with a date and a single word: confirmed. The engineered grass kept the air clean. The substrate pulsed through the roads. The warships hung in the sky. And the world kept building, quietly, patiently, permanently, remembering everything, forgetting nothing, until the list on the obelisk grew long enough that the stone itself would need to be replaced with something larger. They had already planned for that. They had been planning for 350,000 years. They would keep building. They would keep remembering. That was the answer. That had always been the answer. Memory, patience, stone.